minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think you have to go through that whole thing.
It's very brief.
Just make it short.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this program at the summer school. My name is Penny Andrews, and I'm the Dean of the Law Faculty here at the University of Cape Town. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Brian Raftopoulos, who I just met today. I missed a speech that he gave at the Mountain Club about a week ago, and he's told me that he's essentially going to give the same speech, so I'm glad I missed his earlier speech. Professor Raftopoulos is a leading Zimbabwean scholar and activist. He's formerly a professor of development studies at the University of Zimbabwe, where he taught from 1990 to 2006. He moved to Cape Town at the end of March 2006, and since 2007 has been the Director of Research and Advocacy in the Solidarity Peace Trust, which is an NGO dealing with human rights issues in Zimbabwe. Professor Raftopoulos has published widely on Zimbabwean history, labor history, and politics. He was also the Mellon Senior Research Mentor at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape from 2009 to 2013. He is a founder member of the National Constitutional Assembly in 1998 and the first chair of a broad civic coalition called the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition. He held this position from 2001 to 2003. So welcome, Professor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm sure, like many people in the region, you've been very curious at the events that have taken place in Zimbabwe. A surprise for many of us, even those who have studied Zimbabwe for a long time. And even though we knew the military were a key factor in Zimbabwean politics, we always thought that despite that, the politics was in charge of the military. But of course, to our surprise, we've seen some very key developments. I think the trigger for this was clearly the attack on Vice President, at that time, Emmerson Mnangagwa, as well as his key allies in the party, military generals, war veterans, those who thought they were the core of the liberation movement, the core of the legacy of Zimbabwe. And once a group around former President Mugabe and his wife, the G40 group, began their momentum of succession politics, it became increasingly bitter and increasingly problematic. And of course, the attack on Mnangagwa in November of last year was not the first succession battle. ZANU-PF has a long history of succession battles from the 1970s. The struggles that took place when many people died in those struggles. And more recently, in the post-2014 period, the removal of former Vice President Joyce Mujuru, in which, of course, Emmerson Mnangagwa was key, along with the military intelligence which were used to help remove her. So prior to his own removal, he had become quite central to the succession politics. And indeed, the succession battles between Mnangagwa and Mujuru have been going on since the 90s. The events of November, where Mnangagwa was dismissed as the accusation went, exhibiting disloyalty, disrespect, deceitfulness, and unreliability. Mnangagwa responded by saying that the government had been hijacked by novices and external forces with a track record for treachery, meaning the G40 group around Grace Mugabe. He then sent a warning to Mugabe, and at that time it wasn't clear what this meant, but he said, "I will go nowhere. I will fight tooth and nail against those making a mockery against ZANU-PF founding principles. You and your cohorts will instead leave ZANU-PF by the will of the people, and this we will do in the coming weeks. When that statement was made, we thought it was just a bluff, many of us. But soon after that, the commander-in-chief, the Zimbabwe Defense Force commander, Constantine Chiwenga, also sent, surrounded by 90 officers of the military, held a press conference and also issued an ultimatum, saying that the armed forces were the stockholders of the liberation movement and would take corrective measures against counter-revolutionaries threatening to destroy ZANU-PF from within. Chiwenga very carefully, although, used the language of constitutionalism to set out his position. He started out by saying, let us begin by quoting the constitution of this country, particularly the preamble, which states, exalting and extolling the brave men and women who sacrificed their lives during the Chimurenga and compatriots who toil for the progress of the country. So very carefully, as I said, he spoke as if this was a constitutional duty of the military to intervene against what he considered, or the military considered, criminal elements of those taking part. Soon after that, the military took over the ZBC, the broadcasting services, and announced that they were intervening to pacify a degenerating political, social, economic, and situation. And that they were careful again not to call this a coup d'etat. This was not a military takeover of government, but an effort to stop a degenerating political, social, and economic situation. Of course, in reality, this was a coup. This was the military intervening against the constitution. The president is the only one constitutionally who could bring the military into play. This was done against the sitting president and, in effect, was a coup. However, the military were very aware that the language of the coup, the politics of it, would be unacceptable to SADC or the African Union at this point. And so it was a carefully choreographed intervention which had three elements in it. Firstly, as I said, the avoidance of any reference to the term coup and the use of constitutional language to legitimize it. Secondly, a massive output of support, carefully again orchestrated by the war veterans and playing on the long-held anger and frustration of Zimbabweans. For any Zimbabwean, it was good to see Zimbabweans happy, even if it was a brief moment. It was a cathartic moment to see people of all races coming onto the streets and operating. And these were just the beginning. Those were the crowds on that day, massive crowds, all races. And of course, there was a romance with the military. The very military which have in the past abused the citizenry, whether it's from the Gukuraunde period through the election period, these were now being idolized by the crowds. Quite telling. I'll come back to that. So as I said, this massive show of support throughout the country and indeed in the diaspora as well. The fact that Mugabe, the symbol of a longevity of rule, was out was itself cause for celebration by many. Thirdly, in order to provide the constitutional veneer for the military intervention, ZANU-PF Central Committee met on the 19th of November and made several decisions. It expressed gratitude to the military for the intervention, and more decisively, the committee expelled 20 members of the G40 grouping and removed Mugabe from his position as president and first secretary of the ruling party, also recommending that he resign as state president. Grace Mugabe was also relieved of her post as secretary for Women's League, and Vice President Mpoko was removed. One day before the Central Committee meeting, the Zimbabwe National Army had announced that this operation, which they called Operation Restore the Legacy, was over and that a new political dispensation had been ushered in. It was the hope that this move by the Central Committee would be sufficient for Mugabe to resign voluntarily and pave the way for Mnangagwa. In a very strange and surreal speech on the Sunday after these developments, Mugabe continued as though he was still in power. And that much-awaited resignation did not come. The next move, of course, was for ZANU-PF to move towards impeachment. And this began on the Monday, the 21st. Amongst other charges, Mugabe was accused of allowing his wife to usurp government functions and state resources, as well as ignoring all allegations of corruption and misappropriation of public funds. Mugabe was also charged with the inability to perform his functions because of physical or mental incapacity. On the same day this process began, Mugabe sent in his resignation, once again to massive applause from both the parliament as well as the people of Zimbabwe. Of course, the irony of this intervention is that both the Mnangagwa group, the Lacoste group as they call, and the G40 were very careful about using the language of constitutionalism. Even as the army pretended this was a constitutional intervention, the G40 group complained that these were groups moving against the constitution. And these were both factions who over the years have undermined constitutionalism in Zimbabwe massively throughout the last three and a half decades. And so this recourse, a kind of opportunistic recourse to constitutionalism, has, I think, been a key factor in this. We know, of course, that the military have been central to ZANU-PF. Through, of course, the legacy of the liberation struggle, the military have been much more central to Zimbabwe politics than, say, the military in this country, the MK in this country. The war veterans were central to the violence of the 2000s. And those very generals who removed Mugabe were the key to his maintaining power for 37 years. And for a long time, the generals have made it clear that they are the arbiters of who rules in Zimbabwe. In the 2002, they said they would not salute any president who was elected who was not part of the liberation movement. That was an early indication of this. But of course, on the face of it, and officially, the politicals were still in charge of the party. Mugabe and those in the Central Committee and those in charge at the political level were formally in charge, and Mugabe kept the support of the military through a combination of patronage, the fact that he was the pinnacle of the nationalist hierarchy, and the commitment of these ZANU-PF people to the agenda of ZANU-PF. After Mnangagwa was appointed, the consolidation of the military was made clear. His Ministry of Agriculture was a former Air Chief Marshal, Perence Shiri, who was a key to the Gukuraunde massacres in Matabeleland, along with Mnangagwa. The new foreign minister was Lieutenant General Sibusile Moyo, who took over the ZBC. And the new vice president was former commander of the army, General Chiwenga. So there's no ambiguity about who's in charge in Zimbabwe. The military are in charge at almost every level now, and this is a factor. The question was, how did SADC respond? At first, both SADC and the AU made their position that they would stick to their position on constitutionality and constitutionally elected governments. However, as the speed of events moved on, the messaging changed. And soon SADC were responding that they were very impressed with the manner in which this operation had been handled, with discipline and peacefulness of the people of Zimbabwe. Similar messaging, change of messaging, came from the African Union. And very quickly, both SADC and the African Union accepted what had gone on as de facto reality. What's been also interesting is to see the response of the Western governments, those who have for many years imposed sanctions on the Mugabe regime. But what's been clear is that especially since the global political agreement in 2008 to 2012, 13, there's been a move away from the sanctions towards re-engagement. And my sense is that there's a keenness now to re-engage this government, both on the part of the EU and particularly the British government. I would have to say that the British government for some time made it clear, at least the ambassador in Zimbabwe, that was almost common knowledge, that they backed Mnangagwa, and they felt he's, as a reformist within ZANU-PF, he would be an important player in the politics of Zimbabwe. So along with China and Russia, there's been a very tempered reaction to this coup d'etat, and a growing momentum of the need to re-engage. President Mnangagwa's move, participation in the Davos discussions will, I think, be interesting. And we'll also see what the EU do about their sanctions discussion in February this year when the issue comes up again. The US, well, I think President Trump has got his hands full elsewhere on the globe, and I'm not clear if he knows where Zimbabwe is, frankly. But clearly, I think for the moment, they will keep the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Reconstruction Act, which was imposed in 2001, on the agenda and kind of play a wait-and-see game, as others are doing. It's been really also very interesting to see the new narratives of this regime, which has been composed of several elements. One is the emphasis on the economy. There's been a major emphasis to talking about economic stabilization. President Mnangagwa, in one of his early statements, said, "We will not be able to accomplish much for as long as our sense of party work remains hidebound in the template of looking at ZANU-PF as about politics, politics, politics. No more. It's politics and economics. Let us recognize that the best emerge from the marketplace where livelihoods are made. Productivity at all levels must be religiously encouraged." So both this language of the economy and unity, ironically in some ways, resembled the language of reconciliation and development in the 1980s when Mugabe first came to power. There's an echo of that in this discussion. The second part of it was re-engagement with the international community. Mnangagwa very quickly made it clear that he had already begun serious and focused dialogue with key constituent countries of the West, and that discussions to revive the Lima re-engagement strategy of 2015 were going to be put in place. And in his first budget speech as well, the new Minister of Finance, Patrick Chinamasa, made it clear that they would move beyond the destabilizing consequences of the past, and that they would predicate their interventions on increased production-led economic recovery, targeting foreign domestic investment. Also, they made it clear that they would make changes to the indigenization policy, and that the 51% local ownership policy would only apply to diamonds and platinum. There was also a move around the question of the land. Very early indications that this government will be moving towards some discussion on compensation, but he said within the law. And within the Constitution, that means compensation for improvements on the land since it was taken over. Thirdly was a new assault on corruption, a move to move against those who had been involved in corruption. Again, the key targets of this were the G40 group, those associated. When in fact, of course, the corruption issue spread right across ZANU-PF and throughout all the factions. In fact, as early as 2002, a UN report on the exploitation of natural resources in the DRC reported on the various elite networks involved in these exploitative activities. The report went on to say, the key strategist for the Zimbabwe branch of the elite network, the Speaker of Parliament and former National Security Minister Mnangagwa, has won strong support from senior military and intelligence officers for an aggressive policy on the DRC. The military officers named were Perence Shiri, current Minister of Agriculture, as well as Sibusiso Moyo, Minister of Foreign Affairs. There was, of course, the massive movements around the Marange diamonds in the 2000s, and again reports that key military elites were involved in shadow activity around those. So the corruption issue is very deep in ZANU-PF, and it pervades the party and all its factions. I think that what's also clear now is that this whole discussion, therefore, has been about moving the discussion very quickly away from the shadow of the coup towards a normalization of relations through both a discussion of the economy, a discussion on re-engagement, a discussion with international financial institutions, this facade of anti-corruption, which encompasses only one part of ZANU-PF, and I think a kind of a general public relations onslaught around the newness of this regime. And it has presented major challenges for the opposition. The opposition initially were quite enthused by the response of the military, the Secretary General of the MDCT saying, "We are happy with what the army has done. It has done a good thing." Even as time went on, there became an ambiguity that even though they were worried that this would not lead to free and fair elections, the MDC and other parties saw it as a possibility for a new dispensation, a new kind of engagement. In the changed context, therefore, and maybe just to give you, this was the inauguration of Mnangagwa, and also even support from civic movements like the ZCTU. Part of the demands that were put by the crowds, or at least the orchestrated parts of it, were that SADC should stay out of it, and that this must be resolved by Zimbabweans themselves. But the challenges that now face the opposition are several. The first thing is that the cumulative effects of state repression, violence, state infiltration, the effects of repeated party splits, and the loss of financial support from donors has greatly weakened the structures and capacity of the various opposition formations. The serious illness of the opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai has also exacerbated successionist tendencies within his own party. Secondly, the persistent challenges around uniting the opposition and attempts to build electoral alliances to confront the Mnangagwa regime in 2018 are persisting. Since the split of the opposition in 2005, they failed to sustain election alliances, and this has been largely through a combination of a battle for positioning within parties, positioning over parliamentary seats, regional positioning, particularly around the Matabeleland issue. The thirdly is that the political discourse, the narrative of the opposition, has been appropriated by Mnangagwa. Change, which was central to the MDC. They claim, well, we've changed. Mugabe is gone. The macroeconomic neoliberal reforms, those were central to the opposition portfolio since the early 2000s. Those are now central to the logic of the new regime. And the re-engagement with the international community, again, something that has been pushed by the opposition, is also central to the discourse of the new opposition, of the new regime. So the language of the opposition is now the language of the dominant language of the regime. And this creates a real challenge. What's the new message that will be there for the opposition in the election this year? What new will they be saying? And unfortunately, what has happened is people have forgotten just how much the opposition has achieved, despite all these problems since the late 1990s. The very changes we're seeing, for example, the new constitution we have is because of the pressure from the opposition and the civic movement. The same opposition won an election, won several elections, particularly in 2008. They beat a Standing Liberation Party that were denied the right to take over that power. They've changed the discourse of Zimbabwe politics. This regime now uses the language of the opposition in its attempt to legitimize itself and its attempt to move forward. So I think many people will be writing off the opposition, but they'll have forgotten just how much that opposition changed the politics. We wouldn't have had a government of national unity without the pressure put on this regime. And I think as historically as we go forward, people need to remember just how much, despite all the challenges, was done by these opposition politicians. Just to begin to wind up, what does this mean for a broader continental debate? I think since 9/11, as many scholars have made clear, the language of security has been linked to the question of underdevelopment. Underdevelopment has been securitized. That crisis of lack of development has been linked to extreme violence and terror extremism, and therefore the military have become part of a new discourse on stabilization. That in order to stabilize a situation where underdevelopment is so problematic, the military can play a role, even if it's an ambiguous one. I think that Mnangagwa has, in a sense, locked into that broader discourse on the securitization of development, and is playing into that international, almost growing consensus amongst international players that even though this was a problem of ZANU in the past, it's essential to the transition in Zimbabwe to have the same military playing that role. They also, of course, have within the region as a whole the idea and the belief that as liberation movements, they are the sole arbiters of who should rule in Zimbabwe and in the region, and that they are the future of the region. So both these elements play both into an international discourse and into a regional liberation discourse, which has a powerful effect. As we go forward, as I said, there's elections in Zimbabwe this year. The opposition are in a very weak state, and it's going to be very difficult, I think, to develop a new messaging, but they have, I think, a history of being able to craft new messages. They have a strong organizational basis still. And I think the key test now for this regime is whether they will have free and fair elections. Emerson Mnangagwa recently promised in an interview that they will have international observers. We'll see. But I think the legitimacy question will continue to plague this regime until there are free and fair elections. And I think that is important for SADC, for the African Union, for the civics, the oppositions, not only in Zimbabwe, in the region, to ensure that this takes place, so that the question of stability doesn't totally remove the question of democracy from the national debate. That stabilization doesn't become the only factor in the discussion at the expense of all the other values that Zimbabweans, Democrats have fought for so long. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions. Crystal.
Do you see the civil society within Zimbabwe now being able to ensure that it no longer goes back to this autocratic? You know how Mugabe led it all now.
Yeah.
So I think civil society is saving South Africa. Do you see now it being able to do a similar thing in Zimbabwe?
Crystal.
Well, thank you very much for a very insightful discussion. I see you referred to Mnangagwa only on his first name when president, so that's just something that I noticed. So two questions. One, of course, Mnangagwa has been very strategic. He's been visiting all the southern African nations, started here in South Africa, moved to Namibia, moved to Mozambique, and then made all those very pertinent announcements like free and fair elections in Mozambique. In Namibia, he told us about the looting has to stop and money is coming back. So is that part of this new language that he's using? And, you know, are we seeing the support from the region in terms of his legitimacy? And then the second question, we know right now, yesterday the ANC told us that land reform and, repossession without compensation is going to happen. We're working out the mechanics. What are the lessons for South Africa given the Zimbabwe example? Thank you.
Yes.
Where is Mugabe? What is his status and what is his future?
Yes, I'll take one more and then I'll answer those.
Are we going to see the institution of justice in the country and free of the press? Will those two things happen? Nothing's going to happen.
Okay, let me take that first round. I think that civil society are more crucial than ever in Zimbabwe now. Because the opposition is so divided, is so weak, needs to reconfigure itself. Those values that the civic movement have fought for since the late 1990s are absolutely crucial in monitoring what goes on, in fighting for those spaces. For example, making sure that the Constitution is implemented, that the legislation is in line with the Constitution, that the judiciary grows into a much more independent force. Issues around the free press. These battles have been fought by the civic movement for a very long time. And I think, unfortunately, also a lot of funding and support for the civic movement has declined over the last few years. And so it is also facing problems in sustainability. But I think that the reconfiguration of the civics and the opposition is absolutely essential to the movement of democratic values. You cannot leave this alone to a military regime. You cannot. The regional tour, yes, I think it's part of that charm offensive. Very strategically, he went around the region before his visit to Davos in order to speak to key people in the region and key states in the region. And I think that he will get support from the region. I think he already is. I think SADC will be behind this, and they're very keen that Zimbabwe stabilizes, even if it's in this dubious manner in which it has happened. Similarly, and the AU will take their cue from SADC on this issue, as they do from regional bodies. The land question, yeah, that's a much longer debate. Look, I think that the part of the lessons that we learned from the Zimbabwe land experience, one is that now there's been mixed results. There are many more. We have about, I think, a lot of smallholders now, and many of them are struggling, but also there's success in some of their food production. Those are doing contract farming, and even the middle farmers are also a mixed picture. But there is elements of success. And so it's a much more mixed, it wasn't just the disaster that people thought it would be. It's a much more mixed response. But like many of the land scholars are saying now, there needs to be a lot more done on the question of land administration and audit, tenure issues, financial support, technical support, all lot of issues we need to do to bring this to a proper fruition. There's certainly no going back on the land question in Zimbabwe. All parties, I think, agree on that. What needs to be done is how to ensure that this moves forward in a positive direction. I think for South Africa, again, as many scholars have said, it's slightly different because you have much more large-scale farmers here. The small-scale farmers are much less than they are in Zimbabwe. And the kind of pressures for land I think are growing. I don't think it will be the same as Zimbabwe, but I think there are different dynamics at play. But there are lessons to be learned from what Zimbabwe did, both positive and negative. And of course the massive displacements that took place in Zimbabwe, which we're still feeling the effects of today. In conjunction with the economic decline that took place. So I think it's a long debate, it's a big debate, but there are both positive and negative lessons to be learned from Zimbabwe. I'm afraid I don't know where Mr. former President Mugabe is. I assume he's in Zimbabwe. The military have made it very clear that he's safe, his family is safe, and that's been a central part of their messaging, that the former president will be safe. And they've given him a very good pension benefits, which include a lot of very good supportive interventions for him. So my sense is that he probably is safe, and so is his family. What the future holds for his family without him, it's not clear. But for the moment, everything seems to indicate that he is safe. To the justice, free press, again, I think it's essential that moves forward. And this presidency is promising big things for the future. And I think part of the strategy for the opposition and the civics is to hold him to his word and to make sure that these things are put in place. But the real test will be, one, if there's a free and fair elections, and two, what happens if he loses those elections? That will be the real test. Whether this intervention, which has been so immaculately carried out, obviously planned for some time, whether this grouping would be prepared to give up an election if they lost it. I have serious question marks about that.
With the massive unemployment that preceded the coup, what is the situation with regards to unemployment, particularly with regards to all the refugees outside Zimbabwe? What are your impressions? Are they moving back into Zimbabwe? Are they waiting and seeing? Are they staying put where they are? And the other question is, do trade unions still play any significant role? Or are there still any trade unions? They play such an important role in, for instance, the formation of the NDC. What is their role now?
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yes. The rule by is a very poor cousin to the rule of. My question is really in two parts. Does the Zimbabwe constitution allow for an amnesty to be given to those who committed criminal acts in Zimbabwe, the corruption or the mass murder of people in the west of the country? And secondly, if it doesn't, or if it does, should that still be enough? Should there not be, is it not important that there is a prosecution of those who carried out
Yes.
How rich is Mugabe? There? Do you know where you got his money from?
Yes. Sir.
You were referring to the engagement of the international financial institutions. In what way do you think they could influence the economic policies of this new government?
Okay, let me take those. My sense is that the diaspora there's probably many who want to go back, but they're playing a wait-and-see position. For one, they're not sure where this new regime is going. Secondly, the economy is still in a very bad state. Their families depend on the kind of remittances that many send to them from places like South Africa. So my sense is that they will wait. Regarding the trade unions, that's been one of the biggest casualties of the economic crisis. Whereas in the 80s, for example, the Riddell Commission talked about the informal sector as representing tens of thousands. In 2015, the Zimstat survey noted that now 94% of the Zimbabwean employment is in the informal sector. That's a massive reconfiguration of social structures. And what it has done, of course, is remove those organizations in the public sphere who dealt with labor issues, like trade unions. The numbers have dropped, their influence has dropped. And that kind of vision, modernist vision of trade unions, which is the global part of what trade unions are, they're children of the Enlightenment in many ways. That modernist vision has also affected those in the informal sector, who the trajectory of their movement forward is so unclear. It's so uncertain. It's not sure how they can even plan their daily lives. So that kind of political vision has been lost, as well as the organizational capacity of trade unions. The fact is that in the 1990s, the trade union movement could and did bring the government to a halt. The first major strike in the 90s was the 1996 public sector strike, which brought the government to a halt. This was followed by the general strike in 97, the stayaways in 98, 99. So the unions were the national force which provided the impetus for the trade to the MDC. And one of the reasons for the weakening of the MDC is precisely the weakening of the trade union movement. And that's been made. Now, of course, they're trying to organize in the informal sector, but as you know, globally, organizing in the informal sector is very difficult. It's very diverse, the visions are different, individualized strategies are very different from the collectivism of trade unions. And so in many ways, it's been a loss of a key institution and its history in the Zimbabwean polity, and one that we need to think about much more clearly. I'm afraid I can't comment on the new president's riches. I have no idea or where he got his money from. The IFIs, I think, are in quite a much stronger position now with regard, because this is a president who desperately needs that connection, that re-engagement. It's a central part of the messaging of this new dispensation. And it's clear from the first budget speech of the Minister of Finance, they're very keen to return to the dialogue on the Lima talks of 2015 and get that re-engagement going. I think it's going to be key to how they move the discussion forward on the economy. Zimbabwe is in desperate need of assistance, not only on the land question, but also in manufacturing and all other key sectors that used to be fairly strong parts of the economy. So I think they have probably more leverage now than they had under Mugabe, given this new messaging that's coming out. And yeah, we'll have to see where that goes. Let me take the back here first.
Can you give us a closer reading of the kind of man Mnangagwa is, particularly in view of his track record as a leading figure at SADC over a number of years? I mean, how should we read him and his character and his likely pattern of behaviour in the future?
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Do you think there's a slight chance for that Mugabe has to give back some of his money he stole from his people? And the second question is, is there a slight chance that he will see a trial of what he has done to?
Okay. Any other questions?
My question is related to the leadership style and the changes that we've seen in the Mugabe administration versus the Mugabe administration. In particular, engagement with young people, with youth, towards what appears to be a more inclusive approach to leadership and to governance in Zimbabwe. And do you think this is something that would be sustainable into the previous question in terms of the character and personality of Mnangagwa? Or is this a stage act until the elections to gain more favor and to sustain the favor that the current regime has gained through the military takeover?
Okay. Let me first go back to a question I missed the first round, the question on amnesties. I think the Zimbabwe president has massive powers in the current constitution and could probably provide for those amnesties to take place. This has been done, and there's been amnesties in the past in Zimbabwe from the Smith regime period into the 80s. After the Gukuraunde period, there was another amnesty given by the presidency, and I'm sure it will be done again. I see absolutely no chance of President Mugabe facing any trial, none at all. No, well, maybe if he's not around, I don't know. But certainly the key for this, for Mnangagwa's intervention, is that Mugabe, they were protecting Mugabe from those around him. And therefore, Mugabe is a part of that Restore the Legacy campaign which they've been pushing through their intervention. So his safety, his future, is central to the legitimacy of what they're doing. So I see no movement against him at all. I think the amnesty issues are going to reign for some. There is a Peace and Reconciliation Commission, which has been, there's legislation which has been put into place. It hardly moved since it was formed in the Global Political Agreement period. I'm not sure how far it's going to go under this regime because so many of the key figures are implicated in the massacres of the Gukuraunde period and the election violence as well. The return of money, again, whatever leaders have now, they're going to hold on to very tightly. The youth, I think, again, it's the PR aspect of this dispensation has been very skillful. They've handled the PR side of it, I think, very skillfully, including the engagements with the youth. Watching President Mnangagwa talk to them, it's clear that he has a strategy to try and bring them on board. The real test will be, again, how quickly the economy moves forward, what kind of electoral process takes place, if there's any abuse of the youth as there has done in previous elections. All these will be key indicators of where this discussion is going. And again, the jury's out on whether that can happen or not. What kind of man is Emmerson Mnangagwa? Again, judging from his role in Zimbabwe politics, he's played a very harsh role in terms of the deployment of violence. He was, of course, for a long time involved in the security and defense administration of the country. So his legacy is not a good one. It's one that we should be very concerned about. And I think it's something that's going to be hanging over his head for some time to come. What's been interesting to see is the discussion around Gukurahundi is growing in Zimbabwe. Communities, people in Matabeleland are talking more and more about it, wanting it to be put on the agenda. It's not going to go away. So the manner in which they deal with this legacy will also be an important indicator of how far they're able to move beyond the politics of the past. Yes, ma'am.
Are there actually any Matabele in the current government?
Yes, they are. There are people from the military. There are people in the political side. So there is a key. I think there will be a key attempt to maintain a balance as they go forward. It's been a key to Zimbabwean politics, since the days of the liberation struggle. And I think that concern will continue to occupy those in power. Yes, sir.
Has there been any easing of the currency crisis since the new regime has come in?
No. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that they face. The people unable to get their money out of the ATMs, and even when they are, it's very little. It's one of the most urgent issues on the agenda, on the economic agenda, one which I'm sure they'll be looking very keenly to get assistance on. And if it's something that I'm sure for electoral purposes, if they could even get some small movement on that, it would be a huge feat for them. I think for the moment they'll probably maintain it. I think in the past it's been linked as much to political issues as to any economic questions. The ZANU-PF, I think, historically would be very reluctant to see itself falling under a South African Rand regime. And so I think for the moment that's probably likely to stay. Yeah. Yes.
Mnangagwa's history debated and reported in the press. He really has an appalling history. Is it openly debated in Zimbabwe?
At the moment, I think there's a lot of. My sense is that many people want to give him the benefit of the doubt. Of course, people talk about, as I said, there's a lot of discussion about Gukurahundi, and that implicates Mnangagwa and others there very clearly. But there's also, I think, a sense, because of the desperate situation in which people are in, a desperate need for some kind of stability, there's also a sense that people want to see where this is going. This is also tied to a kind of a certain loss of confidence in the opposition. And as I said, I think it's a loss of confidence which doesn't take into account just how much the opposition has done. But I think the need for stability is pushing many people to give this some kind of benefit of the doubt. Yes.
Is there any government person as part of the NDC, for example,
Look, yeah. This was not the most what? No, I think Tsvangirai had immense popularity. Yeah, no, I think he played a key role. Obviously, like all leaders, he has his faults, but I think his legacy is also one of having, as I said earlier, led campaigns that beat this ZANU-PF under immense difficulties. They won elections. And that's no mean feat for any leader or any party. I think there's a big discussion going on in the MDC about there are younger leaders that are coming through. They don't have the same stature as Tsvangirai. But again, that's something that's going to have to be built up in the coming period, because I think, Tsvangirai's health is clearly a concern. But they do have younger people coming through, and that's a battle that's going to have to be fought within the MDC, and is being fought as we talk. There's lots of different elements taking place. It's one of the issues which is causing problems around an electoral alliance, because not all groupings within the MDC want an MDC election alliance. Others just want the MDC to go it on their own. So I think it's something that's a huge issue as we go forward. Yes? That hasn't been set. He just said it would be in the next few months, next 5 or 6 months. So we're not sure exactly. It has to be, I think, before August. Yeah. But the exact date we're not clear yet. Okay. Thank you very much.